All right, let's talk about the Rings of Power episode 5. So if you have not seen Rings of Power episode 5, this is going to be a full spoiler discussion. I am going to be talking full spoiler details, and so this is your final warning. If you have not seen the episode, click away and come back to this video later. We will be talking full spoilers from Rings of Power episode 5. Hopefully you have seen it by now. So let's not delay. Let's get started and talk about this Lord of the Rings show. So if you have been around, I have done spoiler discussions for the first 4 episodes, 1 through 3 in a video or in 2 podcasts ago, I guess. And then episode 4, last week, where I talked about the latest episode in Rings of Power. And if you have watched that episode, you can go ahead and watch that video or that entire podcast where I talk about it. But I was really not a big fan of episode 4. Just to recap some of my thoughts on this show, I thought that, look, the season 1 attempt, I will say, of Rings of Power was okay at best, if not pretty boring throughout. Nothing really atrocious about that show, but a lot of missed potential, to be sure, at least in my opinion, because I know that there are a lot of different varying opinions out there about Rings of Power, and so this is just my opinion. Season 2 came around, and people were saying, look, the trailers are so incredible, this is going to be one of the greatest shows of all time. I watched the trailers for Rings of Power Season 2, and I thought, they look good, they look epic, but, one of the things that really sticks out to me, right? Because with shows, I need to be sold on the characters. What I've always said is that movies are about the story primarily. It doesn't mean that, you should have bad characters. You should try to have the best characters that you can. But really, the most important thing to me for movies is the story, because you're in there for an hour to 2 hours to 3 hours, and, whatever happens, but you're going to be hooked on the story, I think. But TV shows are different. As TV shows, you are not obligated to stay on board. You can shut off the show at any period of time. It is really the characters that are going to keep you coming back episode after episode. Because even, I think, in my opinion, the greatest mystery in a TV show might not be enough to entice me if the characters are not likable. And so when I was watching the trailers for Rings of Power Season 2, I was like, well, it looks really fun. It looks really interesting. But the characters just don't seem like, I just don't really feel anything for the characters. And so that became very evident in last week's episode. But just to recap the first 3 episodes, I thought episode 1 started off with a bang, because I thought Sauron was just really, magnetizing almost. He was so, it was so kind of morbidly fascinating to watch his rise and then his kind of downfall again, as he became Halbrand, and what he was doing with Celebrimbor and everything like that. So I thought that was great. Episode 2 I thought was okay. Thought was kind of dull. Episode 3 I thought was also okay, maybe a little bit better than episode 2 with the Isildur plot, which I thought was better than anything that they'd done with him in season 1, but still not amazing. So then episode 4 came along, and I was really not a big fan of it. And I'll talk about what I realized about episode 4 as we discuss episode 5, but episode 4 was about Gandalf and Nori and Poppy, and then it was about Isildur, Arondir, and Theo primarily. And, there's a lot there, but, we can talk about that in just a little bit. So episode 5, I was really hoping for a couple things. I was really just hoping for the one thing that made this show exciting to me again in the first place in episode 1, which is Sauron. And look, I get it that Sauron is in the shadows. I get that Sauron is manipulating things in the background. Doesn't mean you don't have to show him at all, right? He doesn't have to be fighting people hand to hand every single episode. He doesn't even have to be fighting anyone in the entire show. But, just to not show him at all, I think is sort of a disservice to the character and what's going on there. So that was one thing that was a little bit disappointing to me. So episode 5 comes along, and I'll say this. I think this might be the best episode of Rings of Power that they've released. And I don't know what it is, because at first I was kind of like, it's a little bit middling, and then they kind of hooked me with the dwarf plot, and then they kind of got me back on board again with the whole Anatar, who is Sauron, and Celebrimbor subplot that was going on. And even the stuff in Numenor, for once, was interesting to me. So we'll talk about episode 5. I didn't originally think this. I still thought, as we were hitting the halfway point of this episode, that, I still think I like episode 1 a little bit more of Rings of Power season 2. But episode 1, by the way, of season 2 is, or at least before today, was by far and away my favorite episode of the entire series, which is not saying a whole lot in my opinion. But I think that this episode clearly tops it for me, because I think that it's doing so much with the intricacies of the different subplots, but it's making you care, I think, more about the different subplots while still having an overarching story and a looming threat that I think is becoming more and more interesting as the episodes go on. So let's I wrote some, small notes here, not as much as I do with my DCU or MC rewatches or anything like that. Just some small notes that I wanted to go on as we talk about this episode. So I think, I thought that the Durin with his dad and his wife subplot was not the most interesting. It was highlighted in episode 2 of season 2. But I think what they did really cleverly here is that they started out with the Dwarven rings. Immediately, they started out with the Dwarven rings. And I was a little bit worried that what this show was going to do was do something where it was like season 1 is about the rise of Sauron, season 2 is about the Elven ring, season 3 is about the Dwarven ring, season 4 is about the rings for men, and then we culminate in season 5 with the One Ring. And I was a little bit worried because I think that is just kind of lame. I think that if you have a story to tell and if it just happens to work out that way, then okay, fine. It's gotta really work that way though. I think though, what they're doing here, where they're really just organically telling the story that they want to tell with the forging of the rings, which it looks like we're going to get all the rings in this season, maybe save for the One Ring, although there were some hints here in this episode that seemed to hint towards the fact that we are getting close to the One Ring, so we'll see about that. But I was really appreciative of the fact that we were starting out, or we're really diving into the show here with the Elven rings and now the Dwarven rings, and then we're getting set up for the Rings of Men, and I think that that's really cool. So I think in that light, right, when we have the conflict between how the ring is corrupting Durin, the older Durin, I'm going to say Durin dad and Durin son. Durin dad, is being corrupted by the ring, and then Durin son is trying to get him away from it. I think that is the most compelling that Durin has been as a character to me. I think it's really interesting also how the ring gives the elves and the dwarves what they want at first, right? It restores the elven lands, and it gives the dwarves a way to see the sun again. It gives them that kind of power. And I think that is such an interesting allegory for temptation, right? Things that you think are going to be good for you that are ultimately really the biggest vices in our lives, they kind of tempt you by saying, that first time, whatever it is, it's going to be good for you. And then it just slowly sucks you in until by the time you realize what's going on and people around you are trying to tell you, what's going on, it's too late. It's almost like, not to get too dark here or too heavy, but it's almost like an addiction in that sense, right? And so I think that what they're talking about here with the ring, I think the allegories are strong, but they're also very effective, right? And I think that that's great. Also really loved, like I mentioned before, that Sauron is back as Anatar, still as Anatar, but I don't need him to be, big horned helmet Sauron or anything like that. I think it's great that he's manipulating the, Celebrimbor and everything like that. I thought it was a little weird how fast he pivoted to the Rings of Men. It just kind of came out of nowhere. I was watching the episode, it was going along. I was very much on board. I was having a great time with it. And then all of a sudden he goes, the Rings of Men. We want to make the Rings of Men. And I was like, I don't quite remember where that came from, but it seems like it just kind of came out of nowhere. But okay, we're going to kind of go with it. And honestly, once you kind of get on board with it and be like, okay, I guess that's what he wants. He just wants the rest of the rings or whatever. Then the episode just kind of flows from there. But it was a little bit jarring that he just kind of said it out of nowhere. And, it was interesting that at that point, I was also trying to think, what is his master plan here? And honestly, this episode doesn't really answer that question. It doesn't really answer what his ultimate plan is, because obviously we know he ends up forging the One Ring. But is his plan just world domination? Is that it? Or does he want anything else and it just happens to coincide with world domination? I'd be a little curious to see what Sauron is doing ultimately, like what his ultimate aims are. But maybe we'll get to see what that looks like later on in the show. I also liked how then Celebrimbor started to fight back against Sauron, and that he eventually, was starting to be like, oh, the influence of Sauron, or at least you're in my head. And he says something really, interesting of how Sauron is, or Anatar, I guess, as he thinks he is. Anatar likes to plant seeds in people's minds and then let them come to that decision, even though he was manipulating them the whole time, which was super, super interesting. Then Sauron is like, okay, no problem. I'm going to make the 9 rings myself, which I thought was also kind of interesting because, later on, he kind of has the blessing of Celebrimbor to make the 9 rings, but I also kind of thought Celebrimbor puts him in charge of making the 9 rings. What if that's the reason that they turn, the 9 men into Nazgul, right? Into the Black Riders? Maybe. maybe not. Maybe it's just a crazy kind of thing. I haven't read the Silmarillion, or I haven't read any of the source material that this prequel stuff is based on, so I don't really know. You can let me know in the comments down below if I'm totally off base with that. But still, I think that that's also really interesting. I've only read The Hobbit and the three Lord of the Rings books and watched the 6 movies. But and obviously the first season of Rings of Power. That's my extent of my knowledge of the Lord of the Rings. But still, I think that is a really interesting thing to monitor, maybe. Because eventually, right, I think eventually what you're going to see are the Nazgul, and I'd like to kind of see where they came from. That's one thing I'm very curious about. We do get some scenes in Numenor again, and we get some more with the subplot of Elendil, who I think is mentioned by Sauron as one of the men who he wants to wield one of the rings, which I think is interesting. But, there's this scene, right, where Elendil is because he's loyal to the Queen Regent. And now there's this guy, Farazad, I think, is sort of the usurper king. And, there's this factionalism going on. There's the scene at the shrine, right, which is sort of the big focal point of that subplot in Numenor. The scene at the shrine where this really annoying kid character, this, the guy who's meant to just really annoy you and make you upset. And he clearly makes Elendil upset because, Elendil punches him. And then there's this full fight that breaks out. And then there's this soldier who stands up to him and almost kills that guy. I forget his name. That's why I'm saying this guy. But, he almost kills him and then lets him go. And then he gets stabbed. I mean, that was something that I saw coming from, honestly, a long way away. I knew that I kind of thought as soon as he lets the sword go, of course, he's going to get killed. But it was still really tragic nonetheless. And I was surprised because this was the first time I actually cared about anything that was going on in Numenor, right? Because the Numenor subplot, to me, has just been boring, kind of middling Middle Earth politics with men, right? Men, I say men loosely, humans, right? That's what men means here in this case. I don't think it's meant to be derogatory or anything like that. But I think that this is the first time I cared because it's showing the real human ramifications and the real emotions that are going on in a political conflict. And now you finally get to understand why they're building up this subplot, because it's clear now that the Nine Rings are going to be playing an even bigger role, I think, in tearing the kingdom of men apart. And you obviously have that thing, I forget what it's called, that thing, the crystal ball that I think Saruman has as well, but that the Queen Regent has been using. That's also beginning to tear the kingdom apart as well. It's for these mystical objects that are really doing work here that are sort of splitting apart people. I think that is really Sauron's ultimate goal as he divides and conquers, which I think is kind of a cool thing to see in this series. And I'm thinking that's the ultimate goal here, but we'll have to see about that. So I think that was a really effective use of that subplot as well. It's also really cool that King Gil-galad of the elves, is seeing visions of Sauron, kind of like Frodo when he puts on the One Ring. Really, really cool. There's that. And then there's this really odd, I think the one odd sequence of this episode was when Durin's wife Disa is chasing after this rock and she finds a monster who I think, if I'm not mistaken, because we're going to see a Balrog in this season, I guess is the Balrog. Maybe. I could be totally wrong about that. I actually thought at first glance it was, not first glance, first thought it was Smaug, which I don't know. That's kind of a random thought, but I think it's the Balrog. I would be pretty sure it's the Balrog. So I guess that's interesting. I guess that's sort of, referring to that point I made earlier about how the rings are giving you what they want or what you want at first, and then ultimately they're corrupting you, right? So it's not always going to be what you want. It might be what you want at first, but then later on, there are things that will come back to bite you and haunt you. So that is really interesting. And then what's also, speaking of interesting, what's also fascinating is that then, right, we cut back to the subplot with Celebrimbor and Anatar, Sauron is crafting a ring with that. I forget the girl elf's name, but she's on board with this, or she at least becomes on board with this plot later on. But he crafts a ring, and it turns her invisible, and she sees into the unseen or whatever, unseen world or whatever he calls it. And that's interesting to me because I didn't think we would be getting to the One Ring territory here in the second season, but it looks like we might be getting there. I mean, my guess at this point is probably the last episode. He forges the One Ring, and then the One Ring is sort of the big subplot big plot of the third season, if they ever get to the third season, which it seems like the viewership is going up and people are more positive on the show this time around. And so I think that, it's probably pretty likely we'll get a third season at this point, unless the landing is just terrible. But, reviewers have seen the whole season, and I think that they're generally pretty positive on it. So we'll see about that. And yeah, I mean, I cared a lot about the conflicts going on in Numenor. I cared a lot more about Durin and the dwarven subplots here. And what I loved, what sealed the deal for me, what made this episode my favorite episode out of any of the other Rings of Power episodes is the ending, right? Because Celebrimbor told us outright, he said, you, Sauron, are someone who puts ideas into people's minds and then pretends that you have no idea what's going on, but in reality you're the one who gave them those ideas, and you make them think that they made those choices on their own. And then he does that exact thing under our noses. We think Celebrimbor is getting so frustrated with Enitar, and he's about ready to sever ties with him, and he goes, I'm so mad at you, I'm going to make up for my mistakes, and I'm going to craft the 9 rings anyways. And you can tell immediately this is exactly what Sauron was going for the entire time. What a brilliant manipulation from that character. I don't know, I thought that was written really well, and I think that shows you exactly who Sauron is in a way where Sauron didn't even have to say anything at that point. He's just like, okay, we're building the 9 rings, let's do it. And that is exactly what is going on. Also, a little bit of a tag here at the end where Adar seems like he is allying with Galadriel, which I'm a little skeptical of. We'll see about that. I sense some betrayals coming here down the road. I don't know why he had to capture her in order to do that. I'm not entirely sure. Anyways, maybe because she would have killed the entire army, I guess, in fairness. But yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed this episode of Rings of Power. It bums me out because, again, if we have other annoying subplots to get back to, and what I thought about this was that this episode made me realize just how much last episode was a distillation of all the subplots I didn't like, and we're going to have to go back to them eventually. We're going to get back to the Gandalf subplot, which I think is okay. We're going to have to get back to Nori and Poppy, who I just find kind of annoying at this point. We're going to have to get back to Theo, Arondir, and Isildur, who I just find so uninteresting, honestly. We're going to have to get back to them. This show is not going to be a 10 out of 10 show. I would give this episode maybe an 8 out of 10. It's not going to be an 8 out of 10 show the rest of the way because I know we're going to have to get back to those characters. And in fairness, who knows? Maybe they're going to write those characters really well from here on out and it's going to make more sense. I don't know. Because, again, Isildur, I've been saying this over and over, Isildur has a huge role to play based on what happens at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring in the prologue. He has a huge role to play. So, obviously, these characters are not going anywhere. That being said, I'm really happy that we got another episode of the caliber of episode 1. So now, for those of you who are keeping track, episode 1, I loved. Episode 2, episode 3, episode 4, not good. Episode 5, I loved. And so, the interesting thing here is now, this show is the season is kind of showing me the potential of what a series like this can have. That I'm hoping that the rest of the episodes are great. If a couple more episodes have really, really good potential, just like this episode, I'll be pretty happy about that. But I think that if they have a season of this show, like season 3, for example, where it is all just firing on this cylinder and they kind of cut out a lot of these extraneous characters and all the things that are just, we don't need room for, I think that it'll be a really streamlined and really strong show, in my opinion. So we'll have to see about that. But for now, I'm really happy that we got another really good episode, in my opinion, of Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought about episode 5. I'd love to hear. I know that we all have differing opinions about these episodes, but I'd still love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below and have a discussion about it as well.